Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. We have a special week devoted to John Steinbeck, and we thought today we would discuss his 1937 novel of Mice and Men. Joining us is return guest Jacob Gerhardt. Welcome, Jake.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And why are we still reading after all these years? Why are we still reading and enjoying and teaching of Mice and Men? What are your thoughts?
Well, Steinbeck makes it easy for us, right?
Right.
It's easy to read, and there's nothing superfluous about the book. There's nothing that takes away from the story that he's telling, and so, and it's pretty much perfect as well. It's also great to teach it because it's short, and it's also great to teach it because there's so many different aspects that you can look at, whether it's economic, so many of the social issues that come up, and then just human psychology, men, masculinity, loneliness, not being able to say you're lonely. You know, there's things that we know are going through the characters' minds that they don't say and they can't say. Yeah. So it's a perfect novel, and it's almost, I think of it, I could teach it in 4 days and then have a day discussing it. That makes it really easy. And the final thing is people love it. Everybody loves it. Everybody loves Lenny.
Yeah.
Everybody feels for Lenny. And I've taught it at all different levels, and it works on so many different levels. What do you think, Jacob?
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's funny, like, that everybody loves Lenny. It's so true. My son read this a couple years ago, and we bought a turtle, and we asked him, "What do you want to name your turtle?" And he goes, "Lenny," because Lenny was such he had such a big impact on him, and he is. I mean, the characters you are memorable, and everything you shared regarding the masculinity piece of it, because these are like gruff men working on. I can't work that way. I always tell my students, look at my hands. These are baby hands. These are not like men who work for a living. And I have so much respect. You have respect for these guys because they work so hard, and they go from town to town to do that. That was a living. This is during the Great Depression. So it's such an easy, like you shared, Jake, it's such an easy read. And I've read it a few times, and I've actually, as a history teacher, I've read it when I've gone over the Great Depression with my students, and they love it. They just eat it up. So much fun.
Yes, I do also appreciate the fact, we're going to get into Lenny. You mentioned the way it's such a short book. That really helps students sort of pick it up and buy in. That's part of it, because some students, let's be honest, are intimidated by the thicker books. And you talk about, both of you are history buffs and have taught it. There is a lot to talk about in terms of background of this book. And Jacob, Aguilar just mentioned the Great Depression. So you could talk about the old hobos that used to run the rails, and talk about migrants, as they move west looking for jobs. There's a whole discussion about the Great Depression you could bring in that serves as backdrop that I think is pretty critical for students in terms of their enjoyment, but also to get a sense of setting and character. That's very useful. Let's talk about Lenny. Now, the dead mouse. We bring up the enjoyment of Lenny, but isn't it true? It's almost like he's playing like George. You need George to make Lenny work, because it's almost like George plays the straight guy. And I think the frustration that George feels when Lenny complains about ketchup or kills the mouse and puts it in his pocket, it makes the Lenny character sort of jump out at you from George's perspective, and we're getting George's perspective from him. But what about this interplay between these two characters that makes it really interesting and adds to a discussion for the class? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, George tolerates a lot. So even though George is angry with Lenny quite often and throughout, everyone understands why. And everyone understands, without even George saying it, you'd be in the county hospital if it wasn't for me. You'd starve if it wasn't for me.
Prison.
And when George says it, you feel his frustration and you laugh. But you also know that George does love him and takes care of him. And it doesn't have to do that, but he does do it. I still don't even know exactly what the relationship is. I think it's true, right? He mentions, I was a friend of his Aunt Clara's.
Yeah.
And I took care of him. And it's just, in that kind of lifestyle, he says to Slim, sometimes it's just better off having somebody there. These are incredibly lonely men who are put in the ash heaps, right? They're the refuse. And it's interesting because we do talk about this for the Great Depression, but we can use this in any part of history because there are always people at the bottom. Yeah. It's not like these guys were doing better, in the Roaring 20s. These guys were always the guys who were, bucking barley, $50 a month, living in a bunkhouse with mice and fleas and bugs, spending it all the money that they got because they have no future, no reason to save the money. The big night is to go to a flop house and listen to music and get some whiskey and maybe see something entertainment. I mean, we're not talking about at any time these guys having a decent life. So George comes across as a moral guy. George comes across as the good guy in all of this,
And go ahead.
I'll go ahead.
I want to say that when you're sharing that, Jake, it's so true regarding like they don't see like a future, this lifestyle. And then when a future is kind of drawn for them a moment, when Candy hears George and Lenny talking about their future and maybe having a farm and chickens, and Candy's like, wow, maybe I could be part of that. Maybe I could be part of that dream. And it kind of livens them up a little bit, like a hope, because they don't have hope. So I think you hit it right on the nail. It's like these guys are going from day to day without really, having a future.
Yeah, and there's nothing implied in this book either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Candy says, you can have my money when I die.
Yeah.
This is all I got. And when I can't do the sweeping anymore, I'm out of here. Yeah. Like I'm not staying around. I'm the same as Slim's old smelly dog.
Yeah.
You're out of there. There's something else. If you can't sweep the floor and put some food out, you're finished. Yeah. So Candy would rather be anywhere than that at that point, and that's Candy's near future.
That's true.
At least for the young guys who are healthier, like, well, I'll get another job next month.
Mm-hmm.
So these men who are constantly on the move. Now, when I say George and Lenny, I'm assuming a lot of these guys are like this, moving to find work. They come upon this ranch. In Soledad, this is Central California. We are talking about, here's the central question that we're sort of talking about. I want to read you this section where they come upon this job at this ranch. The boss talks to them, and the boss can tell that Lenny's a little slow in his mind. And we never learn what Lenny has. At one point, there's a lie. I think in this scene that I'm about to tell you, where he got kicked in the head, but he never was kicked in the head. He's never told what he has, but we could see some damage, and maybe he was born this way. But in terms of Lenny, the boss says this: "What stake you got in this guy? Why are you hanging out with this man, Lenny? You taking his pay away from him?" And of course, George is offended. "No, of course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out?" And the boss says, "I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just want to know what your interest is." And I told it, and then George says, "I told his old lady I'd take care of him." But it's not true. And then another point, and you alluded to this, Gerhardt, that George says, what I would do if you weren't around me, because Lenny keeps getting George into trouble. Little scrapes here and there, and then it culminates in a huge big thing at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point he says, what fun I could have without you. I could be in a cat house all night, which obviously a whorehouse. And so why does George do it? Why does he stay with Lenny?
George is a good guy.
Yeah.
George is a moral guy.
And that's it.
And that's all. I think that's all that we need to know.
And I think Steinbeck does that in all his books. He brings somebody in there that's a good guy. Like we just did East of Eden, and there was a Samuel character. He was a good guy.
We talked about because we read Talented Mr. Ripley last week. We discussed it with you, Jake Gerhardt, and then this week we looked at East of Eden, and we could do a class on the sociopaths of literature. Tom Ripley and Kathy Trask in East of Eden. But it also made me reflect on the good characters. And as I was reading this, because there's a really good character in East of Eden, I thought about Of Mice and Men and George. And sometimes there's no explanation. Some people are just good for its own sake. And we can explore that.
And you know, when you have the opposite of Curly, you know, and then everybody else who's really indifferent, right? Nobody's going to lose sleep if Candy's out the next day. Right. In fact, the novel of Mice and Men ends with somebody saying, now what's eating those two guys?
Yeah.
You know, they're just like, they're on to the next thing. And they're not bad guys, but they're indifferent to it all. And that could just be something that somebody puts up with. You know, evils are sufferable. You know, you just kind of put up with something. But I think it's easy to just say, George is a good guy. George is a nice guy. And Slim says that, right? I think Slim says, hey, you know what? And that's just, again, that's the simplicity of Mice and Men. There's nothing in between the lines. It is just straight up. You know, Slim says, I can see Lenny's a nice guy. Oh, I can tell you're a nice guy, George. It's all right. It don't, you know, and then it's like, you know, really rough grammar. It don't mean nothing, you know, it's just, but hey, it's like, it's okay. Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful relationship, isn't it?
Oh,
yes. Yeah. And you mentioned Slim. He does say that I can see he's a nice man, and referring to Lenny, but he also says that he expresses surprise. Ain't many guys travel around together, Slim says to him. I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. And so there's a feeling, in at least from this book, that people are individuals in life. They look out for themselves. And here you have a character that is truly selfless. Now, Lenny helps George a little bit too. Lenny's a good worker, and maybe it's part of it, but there is a sense of camaraderie that builds, and you could sort of, part of the thing you can teach is this idea of how are you looking out for others? In what sense are we, you know, our brother's keepers? So, yeah, it's really a good lesson here, and it serves as a good backdrop for this time, maybe, of real economic hardship.
Sorry about that.
No. I do want to point out, you had mentioned the idea of loneliness, and there's a really interesting scene regarding this character Crooks. Crooks is a African American who works as a stable buck, works in the stables basically, and Lenny finds himself stumbling into his cabin, and Crooks doesn't want him to leave. Even though Lenny doesn't really have much to say, he just sort of repeats, do you think George is coming back? George went out on the town. But he gives this speech. Crooks says, And he says, hey, I just want you to know, I ain't a Southern Negro. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch. He's trying to distinguish himself from the Southern. He's trying to sort of say, here's where I'm from. And he gives this nice speech about his family. And Lenny replies, how long you think it'll be before the pups will be old enough to pet? Because of Lenny's, interest in soft animals. And Crooks doesn't care that Lenny is slow. He just wants company. It's a really moving scene. People don't talk enough about that part of the book, and it's in the movie, but it's really great.
Oh yeah, like goes to what Jake was saying regarding the loneliness, right, of these people, and even this African American character who you just feel for him in the scene. Yeah, good one.
And that whole chapter, Candy comes in too.
Yep.
And Candy says, "This is the first time I've ever been in your room, Crooks." And
That's
they
right.
talk.
That's right.
And then they start talking about the figuring. And Crooks says, if you need somebody to live on that little farm and do some work, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll come with you. They just want to be anywhere but where they are. And both Candy and Crooks open up for the first time, really, that, we could understand that this isn't something that they do all the time. With Lenny there, and they start talking about it, and they're dreaming again. It's something better. The other thing that Steinbeck throws in is what's in Crooks's room. Crooks has books. Crooks reads. Crooks is a smart guy, although he's treated terribly by all of those people. And the same thing happens in East of Eden, where the character,
oh yeah,
why do you talk
the
like
Asian
that?
character? Yeah.
It says, well, this is what they expect from me. And he has a friendship with Adam, and they are friends as men. But everything else that he does is, oh yes, he has this. He has a faux accent because people expect that from him. And but at any rate, later on in that scene, Curly's wife comes in, and she's lonely. She's walking around that ranch, dying for somebody to talk to. And she's nice to them in the beginning. And then she turns.
Yeah.
And then it all falls apart really fast. She says what she could do to Lenny, Crooks, and Candy by just saying one word. But all four of those people at that point have nothing besides it. Lenny has George. Nobody else has anything. And unfortunately, they kind of can't break through that. And even at the end, Crooks says, after Curly's wife says something incredibly nasty to him, Crooks says, I don't want to be on your farm anyway. I don't want to do that. Forget what I just said. Even though we know he was speaking from the heart. It's really sad. Really a sad chapter.
And Steinbeck gets some criticism because some of the words he uses over the years, by towards African Americans and so forth.
Yeah.
But the reality is, he like you shared, Jake. He was taking these characters that we see in the East of Eden, and he's sharing that these are people who have knowledge, a background they could give to society, but at that moment, society wasn't ready to allow them in. And I think the criticism is not.
Well, I mean, the criticism gets to the point where you don't read the book anymore, right. And then you might as well just
it has a bad word in there. Oh no, yeah.
And that's sad that people can't see that is really, really sad, and they destroy a lot of things because you wouldn't read anything by Steinbeck if that were the case. I mean, the entire Grapes of Wrath is just treating people terribly. And you can understand everything in the Grapes of Wrath just by looking at it and kind of going back to how to teach this. If you're teaching labor relations, so let's say you have read Of Mice and Men. The kids understand it. They get it. You can go back to that in terms of labor relations and just say, hey, what would happen if somebody decided to buck barley for $40 a month? You think people would be happy having them come to town? And that's, all of Grapes of Wrath is get these scum, these poor people out of here. They're driving down wages. That's,
Yeah.
it's like really simple economics, which has been around forever. And guess what? It's still around today. So, there's so many different things you can look at in the book. The economics of it, and of course the social commentary is great. It's grand.
By the way, Gerhardt, you're not the only one with the East of Eden book just laying around next to it.
Yeah.
And we do have a video this week on the East of Eden discussion, and check it out. But you mentioned the notions around African American and people discussing how Steinbeck uses it. I take the time out, like you guys, or you specifically, Gerhardt, to talk about what was happening with the African Americans. It's not the opportunity to not talk about a book or read it, but no, let's talk about what was happening in the country. Let's talk Jim Crow. Let me give you some background. And it's a useful opportunity in that respect.
And you don't like say let's not talk about history because it makes us uncomfortable. You say, no, let's talk about it because let's see how we've improved, or how let's not just say, let's not even read that anymore because it makes a couple of words, make us feel comfortable. But hey, where have we come from, and where were we at that time? What was going on in the country at the time? So that's good. That's true.
Yeah.
I do like the interpretation you were making about these individuals who are lonely, and really George and Lenny were the happy ones because they had each other. They weren't on their own, and even the people who were together were alone. The Curly character and his wife, she was never given a name, but she certainly has a nasty side to her. It is funny. You could also consider the film, at least the most recent one, with John Malkovich, that was not recent anymore, but the idea that why is she softened for the movie? She's very much softened, and in the book you have those hard
She's
edges
tough.
to her. She is tough, and so you could look at the differences in adaptation and look at that. But so one of the things that I teach when I've taught the book is I ask the question, is George a good friend to Lenny? This is after we read the whole book, right? The ending. Because some students will say no. And I try not to give a judgment on that because the ending is shocking. And some of these students are very young and it's hard to manage. But I talk about understanding the totality of a character, looking at the beginning and the end. Don't just look at one event as defining somebody. But it does bring some good discussion, asking the question, the open-ended question, was George a good friend to Lenny? So you have that. Any other thoughts about this book and what makes it powerful?
You can talk, again, so many different things that you could go into, again, from the classroom. For example, Curly's wife. Why is she not given a name? And then you can look into what was the law? What was marital law in the 1930s in California? I don't know what it is, but I guarantee that it is the man controls the property. The man has power. I would assume that is always, especially in an agricultural society, which California was. So much of wealth was land, And so at that time, I bet that a woman had very, very few political or legal powers, especially in California. But you could, if you're teaching it, you could go into that. You could do research on those kinds of laws and things like that. And obviously Steinbeck knew exactly what he was doing by calling her Curly's wife. Not even for a moment having it, not even somebody asking what her name was. There wasn't like, oh, I wonder what her name is. It's just, no, it's Curly's wife, and stay away from her.
And it's interesting because she's the only really female character, except the aunt that's referred to by.
Yes,
that's pretty much it.
Absolutely the only only female character. The other thing that's interesting too is there's no interior monologue in Of Mice and Men. It's not until the end of the book where you get into some of Lenny's thoughts about a rabbit, where a rabbit is talking to him. Every other page is action and description, but there is not George thought, or George felt, or Lenny thought, or Lenny was surprised. And so it's written very, very much like a play in that regard, and especially where everything takes place, which is essentially the bunkhouse. They're outside, and then they go into the bunkhouse, and then they're in a barn, and then they're outside again. There's really only 4 locations. And how Lenny works, we don't see it. We just hear about it. Oh my God, I've never seen anybody work like that. I've never seen anybody who could lift things like that. And so that's another, for an English point of view, if you're doing creative writing, hey, try to do this. How much does the language, if you can't have interior monologue, if you can't have a character's thoughts, everything they say and do is what's going to describe what's happening in the story. So for English and for history, the book can be used in so many different ways.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, like I shared before, I definitely use it when we talk about the 30s. But like you said, Jake, these type of workers were happening before that and afterwards.
Yeah.
And so you could hit at different areas of history, but for sure that period. And it seems like Steinbeck was he grew up at that time period, obviously. And so that was something that, I mean, he grew up in that area. So he knew a lot about work. Yeah, he did that kind of work. That's right.
He knew that.
He knew it.
He knew that.
Yeah. So to share that, I think I think the kids would, and they will, get something out of that, saying, hey, this is a guy who knew what he was talking about, but also this is a type of life that they're not really accustomed to, having to go and, do farm work. I mean, they could see it in a movie and read in a book, but, so this is something that you could talk about, but this is the type of life in the early 20th century and even 18th century. But so, really, really rich.
Yes. And the book is set in Soledad, with the Salinas River close by. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the setting in the beginning, but there is some of that, and it is part of the background here. This connection to this area, and it just makes me reflect, as I did in the East of Eden book, of why Steinbeck is interested in this background. I think of men who are hardened, maybe toughened, or at least toughened by the area, by the landscape, the harshness. Really, when you're around animals, you always have to be alert. What does Lenny notice? Bunnies, the rabbits. He's paying attention to mice and rabbits. He isn't looking at the dangers of nature, but I think that this is part of the background of who these men are, and what has created, or what have they been influenced by. I do like, also, you mentioned, Gerhardt, that it is written like a play, and the play is very similar. I mean, the dialogue is there, and it lends to its fluency. Its rhythm is so smooth. So if you haven't read it, you must read.
Oh, yeah.
Like the last book we reviewed, you must read East of Eden, and you must read Of Mice and Men. Any last thoughts about the great Of Mice and Men or John Steinbeck?
Here's a little teaching anecdote.
Okay.
Or teaching. So I used to teach this. I used to teach a modern American history class. And of course, I love reading books. So we read, in 3 weeks, we read Of Mice and Men, and then A Raisin in the Sun, and then Death of a Salesman.
Jeez.
And we tied them all together with the theme. Now, we talked about all these things that we discussed when we did East of Eden, all kinds of things we discussed, A Raisin in the Sun, and Death of a Salesman, but we tied it all in with a discussion and a theme of a home, a house and a home. and what that meant. So in Lenny and George, all they want is that house. And Candy and Crooks want that. And of course, you know, as the title says, the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, right? So it never happens for them. And in Death of a Salesman, at the end, Willie makes the final payment on that house. And he has no one to be there to live in it. And he ends up. And then, of course, A Raisin in the Sun is, you can't buy that house. You can't live in that house. Your father, your husband, worked his entire life for money for you to live in that house. He's dead, and he wants you to live in that house. And people said, no, you can't live in that house. And they said, we are. And so it was really fun to tie those themes all together. And one time, so when I was teaching in Philadelphia, we always had students at a very, very prominent, very small liberal arts school come to our school, and they would spend a day in the school and in the classroom for some time. It was like a sociology class, right? How the other half lives. This is gritty Philadelphia, and the other place was an absolutely it was a country club. You know, it was really impossible to get into university that cost probably at that time $50,000, probably $80,000, $90,000 today. So the professor would come to the school. She really liked the teachers a lot. And you could just tell that she liked to kind of come by and see how the kids were doing. We'd always have two students. And she comes into class, and the kids, freshmen, are sitting, about 33 kids, almost all white and black, with a couple of like Vietnamese kids. They're all sitting and reading the book. And Gary Sinise is narrating. And the kids are just, they can't, they're crying because it's the end. She came in on Friday and we're finishing the book. And the kids were so well behaved. They were like, oh my God, that was so amazing, you know? And then this is kind of the thing I always said, the soft bigotry of low expectations, you know, like the book they have low expectations for Crooks and Candy and all of these people. But the professor said, oh, I can't believe these kids sat quietly and read that book. Like she just thought these kids live in row homes and they cannot stay in their seats. And I always remember that, like, oh, that was such a, you know, she wasn't a bad person. She wasn't a bad person at all. But my God, did they look down on these kids? And of course, when you go to an elite university, you spend a little bit of time in an inner city school to see what it's like, and then you stay as far away as possible from it.
Right.
But it was, and it wasn't me as a teacher. You know, I remember her saying that. She said, that was amazing. And I was like, this is all John Steinbeck. I said, I can't tell them a story to keep them enthralled. John Steinbeck did. He wrote it a long time ago. And the kids loved it. And I'll never forget, boys would come out and they'd be like, see you later. And they'd be like, you know, as if they were outside on a windy day. I mean,
heavy ending.
It makes you cry. It makes you cry. And so I'm always indebted to Steinbeck and that novel for making me a pretty decent teacher when we're covering that, because it makes it easy. And, that's
a great story and a great way to think about this. And Steinbeck, I talk about a tribute to Steinbeck and Steinbeck Week that we're having. Steinbeck makes us a better teacher. He does. And the best writers do that. It's like, hey, they're doing the heavy lifting. Some of the better writers do that, and the students are moved. Really well put, Gerhardt. And I thank you for joining us, because we're having some really rich discussions this week. And I've always wanted to talk about Mice and Men and why it's such a great work of art. So
can I throw one thing real quick? I got a second turtle, and we named him George. And not too long later, Lenny died, and we believe George did it. And kind of ironical, I don't know. But anyway, I'm hoping that's not what happened, but who knows? You know, sometimes life, you know, mimics fiction, right? Anyway, sorry, Rube. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Oh, hey, that's fine. That's good. Your story not as good as
It's
Gerhardt.
not as good as Jake's, though. Not even close to it.
Thank you for throwing cold water on our podcast. We often do.
It's a turtle story. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you for joining us, everybody, and stay tuned for tomorrow's. It's going to be good as well. Thank you, Mr. Gerhardt, and we'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.